Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Hello, and welcome back to a sad edition of The Eurofile. Today, we will say au revoir to Donatien, who is departing us at the end of the month after a very long and fantastic tenure here at CSIS. She is off to new and fantastic things, but it has been a real pleasure to host the show with her. This will be our 101st episode, and it has been fantastic to work with her over the last 3.5 years on the Eurofile. We have a great show that we're going to dive into. We're going to talk about the World Cup, the G7, European Council Summit. We will also have a separate episode to commemorate Brexit, where we did a fantastic interview with Tom McTague, who is the editor-in-chief of The New Statesman and author of what is an incredibly fantastic book, Between the Waves, The Hidden History of a Very British Revolution. We will post that episode separately because we want to sort of dive into the topics today. Donatien, it's a very sad final episode, but we'll try to make it somewhat happy as we talk through some of what's happening around the world. But thanks so much for being a fantastic co-host for the last 3.5+ years.
Thank you for giving me a shot at the chair in front of you every other week. It's been so much fun also having to sit through so many of your takes, but I've learned a lot in how to make a point and not just relate what's happening in the world. So I'm just really grateful I was able to do that and also learn from you.
It is rare to find someone willing to sit through a lot of my takes. I guess that includes a lot of our listeners. We thank you very much for continuing to tune in. But maybe let's dive in. The US is hosting what is the world's preeminent event. It's the event that everyone cares about. We'll talk about the G7 in a second. I mean, that's for nerds like us. But the World Cup is for everybody. And it's being hosted by the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Maybe to just offer a perspective here in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, this is sort of a sad period for Washington. We have the worst economy in the country. Unemployment rate is incredibly high. Elon Musk and Doge had something to do with that. And we don't get to host a World Cup game. And that's not Donald Trump's fault. That is the fault of someone named Dan Snyder, who used to be the owner of the Washington football team, who basically ran the big Washington Stadium into the ground. We have a new amazing stadium being built about, a 10-minute walk from my house. Fortunately, it's not done. It's not going to be done for the World Cup. And so we don't get to host a game. So there will be no game in the nation's capital, which is quite sad. And what that has meant is that the World Cup has sort of seemed like it's sort of elsewhere in America. We did get to have a huge cage fighting UFC match to commemorate Trump's birthday, I guess, and the 250th birthday of America. It was quite the scenes. So sort of we had counter programming for the World Cup. But Donatien, do you have World Cup fever here in Washington?
A little bit. I have to say, for full honesty to our listeners, right now I'm technically in Maine. And actually, people are having a good time watching the games, asking questions about what's happening. I have to also come clean. Yesterday, Belgium played against Egypt. It was pretty hard to watch. I was crazy lady sitting at the bar, gesturing at the TV. We're like, what are you doing? Our defense was in shambles. So as much I poo-pooed the World Cup going into it, I have to say I was not excited about it. There's all these piece of news that we've had trickling in over the last few months, like the buses that are going to the stadiums that are like $90. The tickets are completely unaffordable. There's obviously the political environment. So I was very focused on that, but not gonna lie, now that we're in, I'm very excited watching the games. The US did quite well against Paraguay. And the day we're recording, France is playing its first game. Very fun because it's against Senegal. So there's a lot of politics there. And Senegal won the Africa Cup. Although, 2 months later, the commission said, never mind, Morocco.
They won it on the
which
field.
Is insane. Yeah. Well, yes, there's still a lot of debate around that thing. But it's just, I'm getting very excited about it. And I can tell like people around here are as well. In DC, for anyone who's in DC who's listening to us will know, one thing that bars love to do is specials for a big event. And at least we don't have any games, but there's I'm seeing around social media, a lot of deals that relate to the World Cup. So, you win some, you lose some.
One other factor that had sort of like limit some of or put some downward pressure on the vibes was the the U.S. men's national team coming into this tournament had been performing at a very uneven rate, giving up a lot of goals, never really clicking. We hosted Copa America a couple years ago. We crashed out. And then we played Paraguay on Friday night, and all the vibes came back. I mean, it was probably the most complete U.S. performance that I've ever seen. Paraguay, an astonishingly good defensive record in CONMEBOL, which is the South American Confederation, just looked shell shocked. Now, first game of the World Cup, it's the U.S. is hosting. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but America needs to get ahead of itself.
Yeah, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but Mr. Max Bergman was like, the US is going to win it all.
And I think it is time to reckon with the fact that I think it is actually, I don't want to go into World Cup predictions. It is very unlikely that the U.S. will win the World Cup, but the excitement level now about the U.S. team, because they put together a very complete offensive performance. Well, it was very different. And I'll just say, I was a moonlighting soccer writer for a while, even covered the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. But what was very different about this U.S. performance is that we used to play more like Australia, and the U.S. will play Australia on Friday, where you kind of defend, counterattack. It's very much about athleticism. Sort of, if you think about the Premier League, it's sort of mid-table Premier League club playing a good side. You defend, you counter. And this was front foot football where we sort of just dominated possession. And that's the shift that the U.S. has been trying to do over the last 10 to 15 years. And we'll see how that plays out. But the game against Australia will be quite exciting. But what it did is it suddenly shifted our attention. Oh, we might be good. Oh, we might have a chance. Oh, we can actually maybe play with any team in this World Cup. That remains to be seen. But it really, I think, is good for the vibes. The other thing that we've seen are Europeans coming to America, posting very heartwarming videos of, them stopping at like a Buc-ee's truck stop in the middle of nowhere in Texas and experiencing American Southern barbecue, which is probably our greatest culinary invention by far, and having just like a wonderful time being tourists and embracing it. Some of these videos are clearly done because, a lot of these influencers recognize that there's an audience of Americans that love when foreigners come and say nice things about America, but it is working. It has gained a lot of attention. There's one account, Freddie.
Freddie is becoming very famous.
He was having a very typical sort of American road trip, and now he's being treated to, luxury suites and hotels and like great seats at baseball games. Anyway, but there has been something really heartwarming about the general interaction between, I would say, middle Europeans and middle Americans coming together and everyone just having a good time, everyone being very nice. I think one thing that it sort of pushes back against is the stereotype that we, I think, see here very much in Washington, where if you're a European official and you come to Washington, you now see National Guard folks everywhere. For me, they're now just part of the scenery. I see them every day. They're nice people walking around, but they're now just part of the DC scenery. That is not true in most of America, where you don't have soldiers walking around, our economy collapsing. The sense in DC is all about politics and it's all about Trump and it's all about what's happening. And that's just not the case in like the rest of the country. And so I think everyone's having a very good time and finding that everyone's very welcoming and it's not as hostile to Europe as the vibe is from Washington. And so I think it's a good sort of narrative corrective from some of what I think the European perceptions of the way life is in America, I think is very colored by what many folks are seeing especially when they come to Washington, or at least their political leaders come to Washington.
Yeah, I think that's true. First of all, the entertainment value of all this is over 9,000. It's just excellent vibes. It's been so fun to see the Scots shout a bunch of songs at Fenway Park, just like excellent stuff. It is a little bit difficult living in DC to have that split screen, at least personally, to see like everyone having all these great experiences, which I think is great because when I go home, people don't necessarily understand some of the good parts of America. And some of that stuff is like all of these European fans are living it on the ground, which is lovely. At the same time, part of me is like, well, but also we still have soldiers on the streets where we live, and this country is in a really difficult position, and the relationship with Europe is really difficult. I will say one country that is experiencing the other side of the coin is England, because they have not had the best experience so far. They've had tornado alerts in Kansas City. They've had apparently their kids stolen, and also a shooting near the camp. So there's one team among them all who is not having an amazing time.
It is America's 250th birthday. So if there's one team you had to select that, might be under a little bit of might not have the best time, maybe it would be England. The one other thing I would say is that the this amazing welcome for Team Algeria. Algeria, we're recording on Tuesday, June 16th. They're going to play Argentina tonight. Algeria has become the sort of national team of Lawrence, Kansas, which is one of the very cute stories that I think has come out of this World Cup. One sort of more political point is that, there's been this raging debate in the economics field. And when I say raging, I mean, it's been quite interesting, and lots of podcasts and blog posts and other things have been written about it. But, and this was sort of kicked off by Paul Krugman about whether Europe is actually falling behind economically. And I think this has become sort of a Rorschach test for economists. And actually, it's sort of quite bizarre. Some American economists are taking Krugman's approach, which actually, if you look at the data differently, Europe is exactly where it was with the United States. It's really about exchange rates. And then other European economists and American economists saying, no, Europe has actually fallen behind economically. And then my favorite post on this was from Olivier Blanchard, the famous French economist, used to be at the IMF. It was basically like, I don't really know. I've looked at the data and I'm quite confused. I'm going to take some time and look at it, because that's where I've been. But the whole Europeans coming to America, finding great joy in like things like truck stops and other things, has sparked this, oh, see, look how poor the Europeans are. They come and they finally experience like, great food. And I'm like, these are tourists that are coming to, that are really embracing the moment, but is beginning to play into the sort of politicized Europe is poor. And so they're astonished by the wealth of the United States. And I think what you're seeing are people saying nice things about the country that they're in. And, maybe not highlighting everything that are like, oh, what's going on here? This is strange. It's like when Americans travel, we can really embrace the good things about Europe. But then when we're like, get a drink and there's no ice in it, we're like, what the hell is going on? No, we don't have to like post a video on Instagram complaining at every place we go to that there's no ice. Instead, we can embrace the joys of European culture and other great things about Europe.
I think you're entirely right. It is a little bit of misreading of what Europeans are experiencing when they go to those places. Just speaking for myself, having done road trips in some more rural parts of the area, like across middle Michigan, stuff like this, like it's more a fascination for how could this even be made into a thing, like the Buc-ee's and going to Waffle House at 1 a.m. It's more like a fun surprise shock than, oh my God, they have figured it out. This is so amazing. It's a fun thing, but it's not they're not coming out of it being like, we have to bring this home, except ranch, because ranch is amazing. And all Europeans are discovering ranch right now and they're having a great time. But no one wants to bring Buc-ee's to Europe or go to Waffle House at 1 a.m. when they're like in Paris or in Brussels. We have, no offense, superior fries places in Brussels that are open until 3 or 4 a.m. So I think you're totally right that it's a fun encounter. That doesn't mean that we, like Europeans, find the Americans to be like wealthier or doing it better, because Europeans will always feel superior. They can't help it. But let's not extrapolate too much here from the fun videos.
There's great cultural interactions that come from going to places in the US that have taken a lot of European cuisine, changed it. Pizza in America, quite different than Italian pizza, still amazing. Anyway, the cultural interactions are quite fun. We won't be talking about the World Cup on every single one of these episodes, but we'll see. It depends on how events proceed. But maybe we should pivot to the actual kind of Washington-style summit that is happening in Evian in France. The G7 is being hosted. It's happening today. It kind of looks like Trump is, so far, there hasn't been anything to really cause a real blow up here.
No, but it's more, as always, when Trump shows up to a summit, it's more the apprehension of what could happen. We should say the G7 summit in Evian is coming right after the weekend when there was an announcement of a preliminary deal or framework deal, whatever you want to call it, between the United States and Iran, for at least a cessation of hostilities and a pause of the conflict, reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, until they can then negotiate the bigger deal. And that's not come yet. But that meant that all the announcements coming into the G7 was like, well, Trump has a lot more bandwidth now, so he might turn to Ukraine, which depending on where you stand, could be a good or a bad thing. I think Europeans and Ukraine are a little bit concerned about what that means for one today, but also going forward, potential negotiations, as you've talked very eloquently about for the last, I don't know, year and a half. Every time the US has tried to do something with those negotiations, they've announced something that might look like there's an openness to a deal, but they talk to one and then they talk to the other. And those two things never get reconciled. So I struggle to see how that's going to change significantly going forward. But that's going to be a major topic of discussion for sure today. But who knows? Maybe President Trump, coming off of his deal with Iran, will feel motivated to get another win on the board. Europeans definitely have incentives to make sure they're at the table when that happens, and that they can control a little bit and find ways to continue to support Ukraine in the meantime. What do you make of the summit as we get into it?
Yeah, I think Trump signaling that the U.S. is now ready to get back engaged in the peace talks. Marco Rubio a few weeks ago said, well, there's nothing happening here, so we're now done with this. I think was a great relief to the Ukrainians who didn't see U.S. talks going anywhere and just saw the lots of pitfalls of the Russians trying to push talks in a certain direction. But I think Ukraine is now in a much stronger position, much less reliant on the U.S., and that is mainly due to the efforts of the Ukrainians in its defense industry and its forces, really taking the war to Russia and shifting the momentum on the battlefield, but also to the EU funding being unlocked now that Orban is gone. And they have cards, and they're not as dependent on the United States as they were a year ago. So in some ways, and one of the big takeaways from my trip to Ukraine, which was really quite surprising last month, is how little interest there was in what the dynamics were in Washington. Very different than previous trips where it was all about what is Washington going to do. Very different than my visits to most European capitals where that's the major theme of questions all the time of like, what's happening? The Ukrainians didn't ask that because I think they kind of know where this administration's not going to be that supportive. They also think there's limits to how hostile it can be. And so they're just not that interested. I think it'll be interesting to see if the G7 results in a common statement from the leaders. And we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. This podcast will come out after the G7 ends. I don't expect a huge blow up with Trump. I think Macron is, this is his swan song summit on the international stage. I don't think he's going to want to have a big fight with Trump. But I also think that he's not afraid to have a fight with Trump. So if there is a big explosion, I would say it's probably because Trump sort of triggered it and then Macron wasn't going to take any crap. And then you have something explode. I don't think that's going to happen. The press are hoping that there's fireworks. But I also think that, this summit, maybe just a final point on it, that it comes, I think, what has to be kind of a frustrating 10 years for Macron, or nearly 10 years on the international stage. And I think that's not due to him as much as it is to he never quite had the dance partners. And France isn't powerful enough to really lead globally or in Europe. And Macron, for first half, really needed Angela Merkel to dance with him. She said, no, I will not dance with you. And so there was no big European initiatives. He was, his Sorbonne speech in 2017. And we've seen France be the think tanker in chief, throwing out ideas. And I think the end of his tenure, everyone has sort of agreed now in Europe that France was right about strategic autonomy. I was at one panel a year ago, Eastern European officials, very senior, was on stage. And it was an off the record conversation, or it wasn't off the record. It was Chatham House. He said, essentially, everyone was telling us as Eastern Europeans that we were right about Russia. And I have to tell you that now I have to tell you, all the French in the audience, that you were right about strategic autonomy. Essentially, that France got it strategically right, but they didn't have the leverage, the power to pull Europe in this direction. And I think we sort of see right here in this G7, France going big, wanting to talk about global imbalances, but not really being able to pull the United States or everyone else together. So, but we'll see. I mean, we're sort of prejudging the summit before it comes to a conclusion.
Well, let me ask you then an overarching question that is totally fine to ask even before the summit starts is, where do you see the continued utility of summits like the G7?
Well, look, I mean, the G7 is incredibly important, and the G20 played this role during the economic crisis to coordinate the economic response. The way we should be using the G7 is not dissimilar to how the Biden administration was using it as a way to sort of coordinate Western global economic policy, especially vis-a-vis China. And we have this massive economic crisis caused by the war in Iran. I mean, so the war in Iran is the major focus about this deal that has been done. So how do you coordinate economically? And that's the role of the G7. We have done a report here at CSIS in the previous, I think it was last year, about expanding the G7. Now, the G7 works because it's quite small, but it's also kind of weird that it's actually, there's two EU, it's actually the G9 because there's the Commission President, the Council President, and then you have Germany, UK, France, Italy, and Canada and Japan, but there's no Korea, there's no Australia, and you're sort of missing out on countries like India and Brazil. And so thinking about global architecture, I think is important. The Biden administration said, we're not going to create something new. We're just going to take the G7 and run with it. There was some push to maybe expand it, create a D10, Democracy 10, or do other things. And I think this will be a conversation for an next administration about what do you do with the G7? Modi, the Indian prime minister, is back in Europe again. He's been doing a lot of trips to Europe, but he's back for the G7. So the G7 has become, they have the inner circle meeting, then day two, they have a bigger meeting. I think it's an important framework. But the major question is just what's the role of the US? So is this really now the G6? It's really, EU, Canada, UK, and in Japan that are talking. And so this is why the summit statement will be somewhat interesting. Do they actually come up with agreed upon language that the United States can sign on to? And is there a unified front? I think that's the big question coming at it.
That's a very helpful way to put a nice bow on this. And of course, yes, the next US administration will have a lot of thoughts to implement for not just the G7, but a lot of other summits. With that, I think we're going to close it for our Europhile segment today. I think that's a great bow to put on this summit, and we'll definitely be looking for what comes out of it. Brief note now, just to close this new segment today, is another summit on the horizon this week. Europeans are keeping really busy this time around, probably before they all go off on vacation in July and August, is the European Council, obviously on the 18th and 19th of June. There's a pretty significant laundry list of things they have to get through. It's also the last one of the Cyprus rotating presidency. And a lot of topics are coming to a head. Obviously, Ukraine, always on the agenda, but also very importantly is the long-term budget, the 7-year budget, the negotiations for which are already starting, but it will start in 2028. And the way the European Union negotiates these budgets, they try to have it done at least a year before it starts, because it's a huge budget, although we could discuss at the scale of the EU, is it big enough, etc. But there's a lot of pieces that go into it. And this year, the Commission's proposal, the initial thing that they put on the table, had significant reforms to it. So there's a lot that the European leaders are going to have to talk about, how much they want to put into it. There's going to be another fight about scale and ambition and the shape of the money and where it goes. So that's the second topic that they'll talk about. And then, of course, they will talk about trade. The European Parliament has officially passed the trade deal with the United States, but tensions remain, and there's a lot that they need to look at. And finally, it's also security. They'll continue to talk about what it looks like to protect Europe with those drone incursions in Romania and in the Baltics. There's a lot on their plate.
Yeah, I think, we don't know what's going to happen. We'll talk about the outcome of the summit on the next podcast. I do think that it'll be interesting to see if China comes up at all. I think increasing momentum at the EU level for a stronger response on China. And there may be the beginnings of a real shift in Berlin that still remains to be seen. And also, I think this will be a major hallmark for Ukraine and Moldova as the cluster of accession chapters. Essentially, they're moving forward on the process of EU membership. We've talked about that. A lot more to be done, both in Ukraine and in Brussels and across the EU. But that was a big shift. And they had come to a deal with Peter Magyar, the new Hungarian prime minister. And so he dropped the Hungarian objection. And this, I think, is hopefully can help Ukraine really start to move forward on EU membership, as well as signal strengthening of EU-Russia sanctions, which I expect to see as well, or which we've already seen a new sanctions package. But I think we'll continue to see the EU taking a much firmer line when it comes to sanctions because they don't have to work around Hungary anymore.
Yeah, I think that's true. And importantly, now that there is at least a temporary deal with Iran, they're going to be able to focus on this laundry list of things because the last few summits have been kind of derailed by the situation in the Middle East. I'm not saying everything is resolved. Obviously, the economic situation is still pretty drastic and concerning for these leaders, but they won't have to make that point number one of the agenda, and they can move on to all these other very important things.
So that's it. Dinette, it's been a great ride. This podcast is not ending. We're going to have to think about new formats.
Yes, everyone should keep listening to the Europhile all the time.
We'll see how big the drop-off is
Yeah.
when you depart.
Yeah, my very deep fan base.
Any final closing departing words from you?
Well, first, it's been really fun. Sometimes I think about the SNL skit, when they give a podcast kit to the men in their lives, it's like, go play with that in your basement. Well, we got to do this for real and talk to people for 3.5 years, and you're going to do it probably for another 15. So that's been really fun. Forever, probably, in multiple shapes. And then the next podcast, probably about soccer. But it's also been a privilege to talk about Europe from DC. On the previous episode, I talked about how when I moved to DC, it was kind of shocking to me, the low level of understanding of the European Union in the Washington ecosystem, including people who work on Europe in Washington, and being able to talk about these things and hopefully, without trying to take too much of the credit, hopefully shine a little bit more light on what's happening in Brussels and how important actually Brussels is, not just the bilateral relationships, not just the capitals. So being able to talk about all those things that I personally find super interesting has been such a treat. And doing it with a co-host who's also really fun and has a lot of interesting ideas and can push that Overton window sometimes a little bit is just honestly the best case scenario I could have hoped for. So it's been really fantastic to do it.
Well, thank you, Dinette. It's very sad to bid you adieu, but all the best and happy trails for your next adventure. That's it for today's episode. And so, as always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcast. Please do. It really helps. It helps people find the show. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette. I don't just have one podcast. I have to have two podcasts. But that one covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producer, Shannon Young, to Otto Svensson, Lexi Linefelter, and Anna Douglas Piper, our great intern this summer, for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Next time, though, without Dinette, we wish you adieu, farewell, but I will be back solo next time here on the Europhile. That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.